Please be seated. And if there's any kids that would like to join me. I know there's Isabella. Come on. No? I've got lots of kids and grandkids. I don't bite often. Okay, y'all can just sit right there, okay? Thank you. Good morning. How are you? Good. So I have a question for you. Do you think you know your parents and your grandparents and your friends? Do you think you know them pretty well? Pretty well. Have you ever been surprised by something that someone you thought you knew did something you didn't think they could do? I'll tell you a true story. It was when I was about 4 years old, so littler than y'all. I can still remember this. My mother and I were sitting on the couch coloring in a coloring book. Now, do you know who Bugs Bunny is? Well, anyway, a cartoon character. Okay, so we were coloring, and I was on the left page, and my mother was coloring on the right-hand page. And I'm coloring however I colored, and she's coloring Bugs Bunny gray, but Bugs Bunny is gray with, a little pink and all that. But he was like swimming in water. And then she took a blue crayon, after she colored all of Bugs Bunny, she took a blue crayon and colored over his legs that were in the water. I thought she was a genius. I could not believe that she could think of that she could do something so simple as that, right? I would have colored the water around his legs, right? She colored all of it, and he looks like he's in water. Well, today we're going to be talking about Jesus, that he changed in a way that his disciples just couldn't figure out. They thought they knew him, or at least pretty well. And then he did something completely different. But it was a good surprise. Sometimes there's bad surprises when someone is maybe mean to you that you didn't think would be mean to you. But you know what's the best thing to do always with that? Is to always give them the benefit of the doubt and say, but the person I know is nice, is kind, is in there somewhere, and I expect good and better things from them. So I hope you find something new this week of somebody you know really well and it makes you smile. Okay? Okay, and don't find out who Bugs Bunny is. Get your mom or dad or somebody to show you a picture of Bugs Bunny, okay? It's getting harder and harder to tell stories because nobody knows what you're talking about. Let's face it right off. The Transfiguration, when taken at face value and out of context, is the single strangest story this side of the empty tomb. To put this event into perspective, to understand why it stands like a bookend on this side of the Lenten Passion narratives, as the empty tomb is the other bookend, we must first grasp the movement of Jesus' understanding about his own ministry. And second, begin to see today's text as an affirmation of a decision that he had to come to. So often, looking back on Jesus' ministry and life, equipped with the resurrection stories, we see only Jesus the divine. But that's a little like reading a murder mystery, knowing ahead of time who done it and how they done it. Then anyone can be an expert at finding the clues, in this case, divine clues. Anyway, we are often, it seems, stuck in our divine Jesus mode. But our confession is that Jesus was also fully human, and that is terribly important to remember. If Jesus was only God playing human, then his struggle and pain would only be a charade. If you will, it's not Jesus, the divine chess master, who knows every move before it's made. It's more like Jesus playing high-stakes poker, in which the outcome is genuinely in question until the last card is played. To see the transition in Jesus' ministry, one must note that in the beginning, he presents himself as what one would expect of a Messiah. What I mean is that he exorcises demons, gives sight to the blind, makes the lame walk, heals lepers, restores hearing to the deaf, raises the dead, proclaims good news to the poor. And not only that, but he teaches as one who has direct authority. In short, Jesus is this wonder-working rabbi to whom at least the common folk are drawn. But remember, even in this early stage, that Jesus also indulges in some un-Messiah-like behavior. And this eventually upsets those in religious authority. He breaks the Sabbath, associates with tax collectors and prostitutes, gets a reputation for enjoying parties and drinking. In general, Jesus sits noticeably distant from those law-abiding expectations that the Jewish establishment has for a proper Messiah. There is even already a plot to kill Jesus early on. So let it be said that from the beginning, Jesus the human is trying to bring his ministry into focus, to find what is unique, to define his special gifts. Now let's go slowly through the story as the events actually happen up to the Transfiguration. To review the events just prior to today's text in order, they are the feeding of the 5,000, the predictions of Jesus' death and resurrection, and then the Transfiguration. In these events, we see Jesus is thinking about his own mission. So let's take generalities first. Consider the obvious fact that the tone of Jesus' ministry changes radically after the Transfiguration. From that point on, the Messiah who began his career as a wonder worker does fewer and fewer miracles and indulges in far less purely ethical discourse. More than that, the largely upbeat style of his early ministry is replaced by setting his face toward Jerusalem. That is, his approaching death and resurrection. But there's harder evidence. Consider the feeding of the 5,000. After a long day in a deserted spot, a day in which Jesus occupied himself with the old-style healing and preaching that had marked his ministry so far, the disciples come to him and suggest dismissing the crowd so that the people can go and get something to eat. At first, Jesus seems hardly to have heard them. You feed them, he says. It's only after they have argued about the cost of such a project that Jesus begins to concern himself with the problem. With almost an air of reluctance, he says, "Go see how much bread you have." Even then, his concern manifests itself in an almost minimal way. Jesus simply takes the 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes that they come up with. He gives thanks and proceeds to have the disciples pass them out. The miracle is about as understated as it can possibly be. Jesus, from the start to the finish, seems mainly to be unconcerned and detached. Not only that, but when the miracle is over and everyone has finally caught on to what has happened, it appears that he cannot get away from the scene fast enough. Jesus dismisses both the disciples and the crowd and goes up on the mountain all by himself. He seems to be having second thoughts about the style of his ministry so far and goes off to wrestle with these doubts in prayer. And pray he does, for most of the night, in fact. Then, in a scene that has a dreamlike quality, Jesus comes walking to the disciples on the water. The usual interpretation of this scene is that he's coming to their aid in a storm, but Mark 6:48 says that he was going to pass them by, suggesting once again that Jesus was less involved in their problems than he was in his own. In any event, the disciples end up more afraid of Jesus than they were of the storm. The impression given by the account is that something darkly mysterious was preoccupying not just his mind, but his entire being. The disciples seem to have been responding more to that mystery than to the sudden calming of the storm. They were, as Mark 6 says, completely amazed and utterly confused, because they did not understand about the loaves and their hearts were hardened. Obviously, it's possible to interpret this last comment as meaning that having failed to grasp the first miracle, they likewise missed the second one. Possible, but hardly likely. The disciples had already seen Jesus do enough signs and wonders to keep them from missing this particular point. No, their incomprehension was caused not by their inability to know a miracle when they saw one, but by something else entirely. Something emanating straight from Jesus himself. Jesus was being weird. He was, for all his visibility, off their mental radar screens. This change in Jesus, after the feeding of the 5,000 and walking on water, is underscored in the Gospel of John, the 6th chapter. The next day, as John has it, the crowd catches up with Jesus in Capernaum on the other side of the lake. They too are puzzled, specifically by the fact that Jesus seems to have made the crossing without using the only available boat. Rabbi, they ask, when did you get here? Jesus' response simply adds to their confusion. He first launches into a comment on the unworthiness of their motives in seeking him. Then, in reply to their plausible, sincere questions, he gives them a series of progressively obscure answers. What they really want, as John has already noted, is to make him king. But they also hope that he will claim for himself the kind of kingship they have in mind. Accordingly, having just witnessed the sign and feeding of 5,000 people, they begin asking Jesus bread from heaven questions designed to elicit the desired response from him. Our fathers ate manna in the desert, they say, obviously expecting he will pick up on the lead and come out with a punchline worthy of a Messiah, an updated version of the kind of plausible salvation they know and love. But Jesus gives them nothing for their comfort. He tells them not only did Moses not give them bread from heaven, but that the true bread from heaven is the one who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. The rest of the dialogue proceeds in the same way. They ask sensible, leading questions, and Jesus gives strange, non-responsive answers. He promises resurrection at the last day. He affirms that he is the living bread, that the bread he gives is his flesh. And then he ends with the assertion that unless they eat his flesh, drink his blood, they cannot have life. So, finally, not only the crowd, but also many of Jesus' disciples simply go away, no longer walk with him. In short, in his references to flesh and blood, Jesus has broached the subject of the death of the Messiah, and the weirdness of it all simply puts them off. Even the 12, who do in fact remain with him, stay on only in a dumb and desperate, whom else can we go kind of way. Look next at Peter's confession and note how it brings together all of the elements. Jesus' messiahship is unique, and in their minds it is bizarre to link messiahship with death and resurrection. The passage begins with Jesus asking his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answer, "John the Baptist, or Elijah, or one of the prophets." In other words, the disciples tell Jesus that he is being taken for someone who is part of the old, plausible, reasonable order of things. Jesus then asks them who they say he is. And Peter answers, the Christ. But Jesus warns them not to talk to anyone about him. Presumably, he does this to stop them from broadcasting their own old-style version of a Messiah. And Jesus follows that up by predicting in plain words his coming death and resurrection. So Peter, in turn, proving that Jesus was right not to trust his disciples' understanding of messiahship, rebukes Jesus. Peter simply cannot stand such damning talk from someone he has just proclaimed the Messiah. So Jesus once again rebukes Peter. "Get behind me, Satan," telling him he is out of step with God's way of doing this Messiah business. The whole exchange produces this exact same eerie reading as did the dialogue in John 6. It shows Jesus as a dying and rising Messiah who fits no previous mold. And it continues to stress the change that he has been manifesting all through this sequence. Which brings us to the capstone of the entire series of events, today's lesson, Transfiguration of Jesus. As I have said, except for the resurrection itself, Transfiguration is the single strangest event in Jesus' ministry. It sets together, once again, the theme of old order versus new order, and the theme of death as the key to Jesus' messiahship. And the first of these is evidenced by 3 details. First, the disciples see Moses and Elijah, old order figures, who speak with Jesus. Second, Peter suggests building 3 tents, indicating that he can think of no way to commemorate the event other than with a ritual from the old religion. And third, God, apparently out of sheer impatience with the disciples' failure to grasp the new order in Jesus, simply drops a cloud on the lot of them and tells them to be quiet and pay attention to his son. The theme of death is manifested by Mark's report that Jesus ordered the disciples to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had been raised from the dead. In this lesson, we have the transition from Jesus' early ministry to his walk to Jerusalem. We have the transition from the old-style Messiah to a God who saves by raising the dead. And so, Lent begins. Amen.